30,000 Roman soldiers walked into a valley on a foggy morning in 217 BC, and within 3 hours they had ceased to exist as an army. Not because they were weak, not because they were outnumbered, but because one man had read them so precisely, so completely, that he had already decided the outcome before a single Roman boot hit the ground. This is the story of the most perfect ambush ever executed in the history of warfare. Before we talk about the lake, we need to understand the moment Rome found itself in. Because by the spring of 217 BC, Rome was not simply fighting a war. It was fighting for the idea that it could not be beaten. And that idea had already taken its first serious blow. 6 months earlier, at the river Trebia in the frozen north of Italy, a Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca had destroyed an entire Roman army in the middle of a snowstorm. He had done it with such clinical brilliance that it didn't even feel like a battle. It felt like a demonstration. Rome's answer was what Rome always did: replace the commanders, raise more legions, and send them north to fix the problem. 2 new consuls. 2 fresh armies. One of those consuls was a man named Gaius Flaminius. Flaminius was popular. He was aggressive. He had made his name crushing Gallic tribes north of the Po, and the people of Rome loved him for it. But the Senate, which had despised him for years because of exactly that kind of populist ambition, did not trust his judgment. And the Senate, it turned out, was right. Flaminius commanded the western road south through Etruria. His fellow consul Servilius held the eastern road. Between them, those 2 passes covered every viable route Hannibal could take deeper into Italy. The plan was simple. No matter which road Hannibal chose, they would catch him between 2 armies in the mountain passes, where his cavalry, the thing that made him most dangerous, would be useless on narrow ground. On paper, it was a sound strategy. The problem was that Hannibal did not use either road. Here is the gamble that changed everything. Between the 2 Roman armies and the open country of central Italy lay the Arno marshes, a vast, flooded plain that swelled every spring into a waterlogged nightmare of mud, stagnant water, and fog. Nobody guarded it. Nobody needed to. It was simply assumed to be impassable. Hannibal crossed it. 4 days and 4 nights in the dark water. Men lost to fever and drowning. Horses and mules swallowed by the mud. The column never stopped because there was no solid ground to stop on. His Gallic infantry, already the most difficult men in his army to keep disciplined and committed, bore the worst of it at the rear of the column. They kept moving because Hannibal made them move. The African and Iberian veterans pushed through it because they had followed him over the Alps and they believed in him. But the marsh did not come away clean. It took hundreds of men. It took the pack animals. And it took something else. It took one of Hannibal's eyes. An infection, untreated during 4 sleepless days in the water, cost him the sight in his right eye permanently. He had it bandaged and kept moving. When the one surgeon who managed to reach him said he needed rest to save the eye, Hannibal's answer was, "Wrap it and keep going." What the marsh gave in return was everything. Hannibal emerged into the green rolling country of Etruria, behind both Roman armies, between them and Rome itself, with 50,000 men that no Roman scout had seen or tracked. For days, Rome still believed Hannibal was somewhere in the north, bottled up by their own blocking forces. He was already burning their countryside. This was the psychological masterstroke that would drive everything that followed. Flaminius had positioned himself at the town of Arretium, watching the western road. And one morning he woke up to find the smoke of burning farms rising from the south, from the direction of Rome. Hannibal had gone around him, through the impossible route, and was now marching through the territory Flaminius was personally responsible for protecting. More than that, Hannibal had specifically directed his Gauls, men whose fathers and grandfathers had been driven off their lands by Flaminius himself, to burn and plunder his territory with maximum visibility. Every column of smoke was a personal insult. Every farm burning in the south was Hannibal saying to Flaminius, "You cannot protect these people, and everyone can see it." Flaminius's officers urged him to wait for the second consul, to sit behind the walls of Arretium until Servilius arrived and they could face Hannibal with double the force. And for a time, Flaminius did hold. It was not in his nature, but he held, until Hannibal stopped waiting for him to break and simply drove his army further south, deeper toward Rome, making it impossible for Flaminius to remain still another day without looking like he had abandoned the people of Italy entirely. Flaminius broke camp before dawn. No council of officers, no formal orders. He simply moved, and 30,000 men followed him south down the burning trail, marching hard, eyes forward, and already running exactly the way Hannibal needed them to run. Hannibal had scouts out ahead of the Roman column within hours of Flaminius breaking camp. He knew the pace. He knew the direction. He knew exactly how long he had. And somewhere north of Lake Trasimene, his own riders found him what he was looking for. The northern shore of Lake Trasimene is one of those pieces of ground that seems designed by geography itself to destroy an army. The lake fills the south. To the north, a ridge of wooded hills rises steeply from the water's edge, leaving a narrow corridor of flat ground between them, barely wide enough for a column of men to march through, too narrow to deploy a battle line, too hemmed in to maneuver. At the western end of this corridor, a tight defile. At the eastern end, the road enters through another pass. And everywhere, in the spring mist that rolled off the water every morning, visibility collapsed to almost nothing. Hannibal walked the ground personally. What he designed in the hours that followed was not an ambush in the conventional sense, a force hidden in one place, waiting to spring. What he designed was a trap that used the entire landscape as a weapon. His heavy infantry, the battle-hardened African and Iberian veterans, went to the far end of the valley, blocking the eastern exit completely. They would be the wall. Whatever Roman force made it to that end of the corridor would have nowhere to go. Along the length of the hills above the road, Hannibal positioned his Gallic infantry in the trees, stretched across the full width of the ridge, every man ordered to lie still. No fires, no voices, no silhouette against the skyline. Thousands of men in the dark, on a hillside, in silence. At the western entrance to the valley, his cavalry under Hannibal waited behind the ridge's shoulder, ready to swing across the road the moment the last Roman soldier passed through the western defile, sealing the trap from behind. And far ahead at the eastern end of the valley, past the blocking infantry, he had campfires lit, visible from the road in the early morning, letting the Romans see smoke and assume Hannibal's camp was somewhere ahead, that they were still chasing him, that there was still a rear they could catch. The genius of it was not any single element. It was the totality. Everything in that valley was designed to tell the Romans exactly one lie, that the hills were empty, the road was safe, and the enemy was somewhere ahead of them, running. He had read Flaminius so precisely that he did not need to guess what the consul would do. He had simply arranged the world so that Flaminius had no other choice to make. And there was one more layer. Flaminius had not been sending scouts into the high ground. His army had been marching hard for days, following a trail of burning farms. Angry men in a hurry look forward. They do not look up. Roman military doctrine required scouts, but doctrine means nothing when the commander is furious and the enemy seems to be in reach. The Roman soldiers who marched north of Lake Trasimene on the morning of June 21st, 217 BC, did not raise their eyes to the hills. And the hills were full. The ancient sources record that before the march that morning, the omens were terrible. The sacred chickens refused to eat, a dire sign in Roman religious practice. The standard of Flaminius's unit was stuck in the ground and could not be pulled free. And as the army crossed a bridge in the early darkness, a horse stumbled and threw its rider. Every one of these signs was presented to Flaminius, and everyone was dismissed. History has remembered them not because Romans were superstitious, though they were, but because what came next made every one of them seem, in hindsight, like a prophecy. The fog came off the lake before dawn, thick and gray and total. By the time the Roman vanguard entered the western defile, the hills above them had disappeared entirely into the mist. The column filed in. The road narrowed. On the left, the lake. On the right, the hillside rising into white nothing. And somewhere ahead in that white smoke, Hannibal's fires. The entire Roman army filed into the valley. 30,000 men strung out in a marching column, shields slung, not deployed, moving as a river moves, following the road wherever the road went. The vanguard reached the blocking force at the far end and the collision began, the first sound that told the men at the rear of the column that something had contacted. They assumed it was a skirmish at the front. They kept walking. Then Hannibal gave the signal. The hills came down all at once. The entire length of the ridge. Every Gaul who had been lying still in the dark and the cold and the silence for hours poured off the slopes and into the flank of the Roman column simultaneously. Not at one point. Not from one direction. Everywhere. The length of the entire column at the same moment. And at the western entrance, the cavalry swung across the road behind the Roman rear and sealed it shut. The Romans inside that valley had no time to understand what was happening before they were already fighting for their lives. There was no moment to form a line, no moment to unsling shields and lock them together and present a front. The blow came from the flank while the army was still in marching formation, which is to say, in the worst possible configuration for absorbing a side attack. Men at the front were locked against the African wall. Men in the middle were being hit from the hills. Men at the rear turned and found the road closed behind them. And everywhere, in the fog, the noise was total. Screaming and the crash of weapons and the sound of men dying, and over all of it, the impossible fact that no one could see further than a few feet in any direction. What happened in the next 3 hours was not a battle. A battle implies two armies in contest. What happened at Lake Trasimene was a systematic destruction, conducted in segments against men who could not coordinate, could not retreat, and could not even reliably find the men next to them. The ancient historian Polybius records that a significant earthquake struck the region during the fighting, strong enough to topple buildings in nearby towns, and not one man on that field felt it. The violence around them was so absolute that the ground itself moving registered as nothing. Flaminius was found and killed in the center of the fighting. The sources disagree on exactly how. One account says a Gallic horseman recognized him and ran him down personally, settling the deepest of old grievances with a single blow. What all sources agree on is what happened after. The Gauls were so consumed by hatred for this specific man that they tore his body apart so completely that when the battle was over and Hannibal sent men to find Flaminius to give him a proper burial, the gesture of respect one commander extends to another, there was nothing left to find. At the eastern end of the valley, one group of roughly 6,000 Romans broke through the African line through sheer violent desperation and escaped up into the surrounding hills. They survived one day. Surrounded the following morning, out of food, out of options, they surrendered to Hannibal's cavalry. Almost none of them ever saw Italy again. 15,000 Romans dead, most of the rest enslaved. In 3 hours. And it had started as a morning march. On the field after the battle, Hannibal did something that reveals exactly how he thought about this war. He had his men sort the prisoners into two groups, Roman citizens on one side, Italian allies on the other. The Italians, Men from the cities and towns of the peninsula who had marched under Roman command were freed without ransom. He looked at each group of them and said the same thing. "I did not cross the Alps to make war on you. Go home. Tell your cities what you saw. My quarrel is with Rome, not with you." It was not mercy. It was a message planted in thousands of men who would now walk home to their cities across Italy and carry that message with them. Whose war is this, really? And the plunder from the Roman dead rearmed his infantry. His men threw away their own worn-out equipment and picked up captured Roman gear, the mail shirts, the heavy shields, the Roman helmets. The army that marched out of the Trasimene Valley looked from a distance like a Roman army. But Hannibal was not finished that week. The other consul, Servilius, was already marching west with his army to link up with Flaminius, not yet knowing Flaminius was dead. He had sent 4,000 cavalry racing ahead to reach him faster under a commander named Centenius. Hannibal learned those 4,000 horse were on the road before the Romans learned they had lost a battle. He sent Maharbal and his cavalry to intercept them near Assisi, 20 miles from the lake. Half were killed in the first charge. The rest were run onto a hill and surrendered the next day. The second Roman consul had lost his cavalry and now had no idea where Hannibal was, what strength he had, or whether his own army would survive the week. He halted. He waited. And for the first time, Rome understood that it was no longer dictating the terms of this war. Within weeks of Trasimene, the Roman Senate took a step it had not taken in living memory. It appointed a dictator, one man given absolute command of the entire war, a general named Quintus Fabius Maximus. And Fabius's strategy, built from the wreckage of 2 destroyed armies in 6 months, was simply this: do not fight Hannibal in open battle. Shadow him, cut off his foragers, deny him supplies. Make Italy too expensive to occupy without ever letting him have the decisive confrontation he needed. It worked for a while. It bought Rome time, but it drove the Roman people, accustomed to winning through aggression, to fury. They called Fabius the delayer. They called it cowardice. And eventually, they overruled him. A year later, at a place called Cannae, Rome gathered the largest army it had ever assembled in a single battle, somewhere between 70 and 80,000 soldiers, and threw all of it at Hannibal at once. By nightfall, most of them were dead. Cannae is still considered the most tactically perfect battle in the history of warfare and the single bloodiest day in the history of Rome. But it could not have happened without Trasimene. Because Trasimene was where Rome learned, too late, that it was not fighting a general who made mistakes. What happened at that lake in 217 BC was something rarer than a military victory. It was a total reading of another human being, a commander who understood his enemy's psychology so completely that he turned that psychology into the trap itself. Flaminius did not walk into an ambush. He was guided into it step by step by a man who had understood exactly what he would do before he had done any of it. The hills, the fog, the burning farms, the decoy fires, none of it would have worked without the one thing Hannibal saw with perfect clarity: that Flaminius's pride was not a weakness he sometimes showed. It was the most reliable thing about him. And Hannibal built the most perfect ambush in military history around it. The most dangerous trap is not the one your enemy digs in the earth. It is the one he builds inside your own mind.